Degenerates would lampoon them during a segment on the July 6th episode of Raw, with them there each dressing up as a different member of the heel group and mocking them with cartoonish impressions. But while this segment was certainly popular at the time, it's one you're unlikely to see referenced on WWE TV today, given that it's become controversial in the years since for its use of blackface. That said, though, this was the climate of the time, with it being the era of South Park, and so crowds lapped it up as it was happening. And they lapped it up just as much when the game moved into a singles feud with The Rock from there, with both men battling it out to see who would become the next top guy in the company, a battle that would ultimately see Triple H beat the Great One in a ladder match at that year's SummerSlam on August 30th. That said, though, it wasn't all rainbows for the fan favorites in 1998, as they would soon have to face a ghost from the past when Shawn Michaels returned to the company as the new on-screen commissioner, with him now acting as a foil to his former friends, making their life difficult at every turn. And as it happened, this adversarial relationship was also being mirrored off-screen as, by then, tired of dealing with HBK and his drug-addled behavior, the game would cut him out of his life for a period, with this severing their years-long friendship. And further adding to these woes, back on screen, DX would gradually begin to fall apart as they started to turn on each other and go their own separate ways throughout the course of 1999, with this all kicking off on January 25th of that year when China abandoned the group so as to join up with the corporation instead. Soon after this, it would be revealed that Triple H had once again returned to the dark side too when he turned on X-Pac at WrestleMania 15, there reuniting with the Ninth Wonder of the World once more as the two became a power couple within the corporation. And so now, with only 3 members left, X-Pac would try to recruit Kane into the stable so as to bolster up the ranks. This, however, was something that would be met with resistance from Billy Gunn, and as a result, in the weeks that followed, he would grow more and more frustrated with X-Pac, eventually attacking him on the March 2nd, 1999 episode of Sunday Night Heat, and turning heel, as he from there went out on his own. So with only 2 now left standing, you would think it would have made sense for Waltman and Road Dogg to call it a day there and go their separate ways. In the end, though, rather than doing this, they chose to limp on for a while yet, acting as a tag team who desperately clung to the glory days of DX. But after a while, even this would run its course, with many from there expecting that the group was dead for good. That's why it came as such a surprise to those people then when, on October 25th of that year, the group would come back together once more, this time acting as full-blown villains as they helped the game to hold on to the WWE title that he just recently won. And further solidifying this heel turn, X-Pac would turn on his friend Kane at this point too, with this leading to the two feuding for the next couple of months as, elsewhere, the New Age Outlaws would return to the tag team division, all while Triple H segued into a feud with Vince McMahon himself, a feud that would soon see the Game try to get one over on the boss by getting his daughter Stephanie drunk and then marrying her in a shotgun wedding in Vegas. Yes, despite Triple H and Chyna's real-life relationship being well publicized by that point, in storyline, the two would remain separate as the Ninth Wonder of the World was tactically left out of this version of DX, with this setting the stage for the WWE Champion to eventually reveal to the world that Stephanie had in fact been in on the whole thing all along, and that she had fallen in love with Triple H after seeing how he'd gone after her father, the very father who had tried to sacrifice her to The Undertaker earlier that same year. And as the months went on, this storyline relationship would become something else entirely, as it eventually blossomed into a real-life romance, with Chyna ending up being the odd woman out in this love triangle, something which would contribute towards her exit from the company soon thereafter. Still, Stephanie wouldn't be the only female member of this version of DX, as she would soon be joined by X-Pac's new girlfriend Tori as well, the very same woman who had previously been storyline involved with Kane, and who had recently turned on him as part of the Big Red Machine's still ongoing feud with Waltman. And so now, with the third incarnation fully formed, the Degenerates would find themselves flipping the script and acting as authority figures for the first time, with this role coming as a result of Triple H and Stephanie's power couple temporarily driving both Vince and Shane McMahon out of the company at the start of 2000. And as authority figures, DX would make life a living hell for every babyface on the roster, with them saving a particular level of wrath for Mick Foley, the man whom the Game would feud with over the WWE title in January and February. Hell, even when Vince and Shane returned in March, it wouldn't change the power dynamics much, as they would soon find themselves on the same side as the heels again, with this only serving to solidify DX's power even more, as they continued to reign strong as the top stable in the industry. And that was how it went for the first half of 2000 then, with the DX McMahon-Helmsley faction running things, helping to keep Triple H in the title picture with The Rock, while elsewhere, Stephanie McMahon was becoming the women's champion, and Road Dogg and X-Pac were returning to tag team action. Sure, there would be bumps in the road for the group, like when Billy Gunn was ousted after suffering an injury that took him out of action for a while, but aside from that, the future looked bright for the corporate degenerates. Unfortunately, though, as with all good things, it would have to come to an end eventually. And this would happen in the summer of that year when Road Dogg and X-Pac, frustrated with their lack of success as a team, turned on each other prior to SummerSlam, with this situation ending up leading to a match between the two at that pay-per-view as they both from there broke away from the group. But this didn't really matter to Triple H anymore because he, by then, no longer needed them, as he'd become one of the top stars of the industry on his own merits, with this being somewhere he would remain for the rest of his career. And so, aside from one more brief team-up to take on the Radicals on the November 6th episode of Raw later that year, that would be it for the stable, all until 2006, of course, by which point one of the OG members of the group, Shawn Michaels, would have returned from his career-ending injury. Yes, a couple of years prior to this fourth reunion, HBK would have made his return to the ring, his back injury having had time to heal up during his time away. And upon his return then, a tease of a DX revival with his old friend Triple H would immediately be hinted at, with the two having mended fences in real life by now. Ultimately, though, at that point, the storyline would see the two feud together for a while instead, having one of the best matches in WWE history at SummerSlam 2002 in the process. That said, come 2006, it looks like it was finally going to be on, as at WrestleMania 22 in April of that year, both men would perform crotch chops during their respective matches, with them from there increasingly being interlinked on screen again, as finding a common enemy in the McMahons, they eventually decided it was time to return to the glories of the past, as on the June 12th episode of Raw, they would formally reunite once more, taking on the Boss's hired guns, the Spirit Squad, in a 5-on-2 handicap match at June 25th's Vengeance. But despite the excitement of seeing the duo back together again, fans who enjoyed the stable's shock jock antics of the 90s were ultimately left somewhat disappointed when it became clear that by now, as well as Michaels' born-again Christian beliefs. And while some older fans would criticize this new iteration of the once outrageous stable for these reasons, a lot of kids would get introduced to them for the first time here too, with this ending up being their version of DX. Even Triple H, who by then was a real-life member of the McMahon family, the irony of which wasn't lost on him as he would playfully play this up in his promos, argued that there was no way they could ever go back to being the braggadocious couple of kids they'd been in the 90s because they were by now pushing 40 and simply weren't those people anymore. So with that in mind then, the fourth iteration of DX would see much more cartoon-like antics as the duo repeatedly made fools of Vince and Shane. As well as that, they would have a notable feud against Rated RKO, with the elder statesman here helping to get Edge and Randy Orton over to another level. That said though, as time went on and both men would take sabbaticals from TV at various points, the focus became less and less on DX and more on their singles actions once again, with this being something that was especially noticeable when HBK became intent on ending The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak in 2009 and 2010, so much so that he would even put his own career on the line. And when Shawn was ultimately unable to do this, being forced to retire as a result, Triple H, in one last show of solidarity to his friend, would spend the next 2 years trying to beat the dead man too, with all this climaxing in the Hell in a Cell end of an era match at WrestleMania 28, which saw Michaels even act as a special guest referee. After that night, though, realizing he was unable to beat The Undertaker, the game would move on to other things as the Heartbreak Kid settled into retirement. And well, from there would be the occasional one-night reunion, such as the time Michaels returned at Raw 1000 on July 23, 2012, calling out Billy Gunn, Road Dogg, and X-Pac as all 5 members, Triple H included, celebrated in the ring. It was clear that the days of DX as an active stable were done. and that anything else that happened with it now was going to be an exercise in nostalgia. Still, it was a nice piece of nostalgia regardless, and one that WWE would only be too happy to play up whenever they needed to pop a quick rating going forward. Hell, at one point, the company would even convince Triple H and HBK to get in the ring one more time when Michaels came out of retirement for one night at November 2nd, 2018's Crown Jewel. But the less said about that one, the better. No, the best thing to do is to remember DX for what it was across its various incarnations, one of the best and most influential wrestling stables of all time. Yes, whether it be the original collective of bratty heels, the later faction of fun-loving babyfaces, the authority figures of the McMahon-Helmsley era, or the middle-aged goofballs of the mid-2000s, D-Generation X will always remain one of the best things about WWE. And if you're not down with that, we got 2 words for ya! Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. There have been a lot of great stables throughout wrestling history. Names like the Four Horsemen, Generation X, and The Shield are evidence enough of this. That said, while all these were great and did huge things for their respective companies, perhaps no other collective has ever changed the industry as much as the one first created by Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall in 1996. Yes, we're finally looking at the biggest of them all, the one which arguably started the late 90s boom period and took WCW to previously unseen levels of success, then went a long way towards killing that same company with its own lethal dose of poison just a few years later. So join us today as we take a deep dive into their entire run from start to finish in For Life, the NWO story. Of course, the origins of what would become the New World Order really stretch back to mid-90s WWF, as there, between 1994 and 1996, 5 men would come together behind the scenes to form the Clique, a group who went on to pretty much run the show in New York for a while and cause major headaches for everyone around them. But given the fact that the group's numbers included Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and the 1-2-3 Kid, they were able to get away with any heat they created on account of how important they were to the on-screen product at the time. Unfortunately, though, the Clique's reign of terror would seemingly come to an end in the spring of 1996, as at this point, with WWF in poor financial state and Diesel and Razor Ramon being unhappy with their payoffs, they choose to leave and instead take the offer of a big money contract from Vince McMahon's chief rivals, World Championship Wrestling. And that's where the other part of the NWO origin comes into play, as while he was negotiating with the 2 soon-to-be incoming WWF stars, WCW boss Eric Bischoff would also be attending a New Japan Pro Wrestling show where he watched an invasion-style angle play out when rival promotion Union of Wrestling Force International attempted a hostile takeover. So realizing there was something in this idea, he'd take it back with him to the US, where now realizing he had the perfect 2 figures with which to carry it out, he'd immediately get to work on changing the North American wrestling scene forever. Yes, it was on the May 27th episode of Nitro that year when, just days after wrestling his final match for WWF, Razor Ramon would come out of the crowd during a match between the Mauler and Steve Dahl. And immediately bringing the show to a halt then, he'd enter the ring and grab a mic, from there telling everyone, "You all know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here." Of course, the intention here was to portray the idea that Ramon was still under contract with Vince McMahon, and that he'd been sent over to invade the competition, something which the bad guy only added fuel to when he continued his promo by telling WCW to be ready for a war, and for a big surprise he had planned in the weeks to come. And just 2 weeks later, that big surprise would prove to be Diesel, as on the June 10th episode of Nitro, he would appear too, now using his real name of Kevin Nash, just as Ramon had reverted to using his actual name of Scott Hall. That's right, with each man now using their legitimate names and showing up week in and week out wearing street clothes, usually disrupting the show in some form before being escorted out by security, it only served to add to the realism of the whole thing and make many fans at the time start tuning in as they waited to see how this whole thing would play out. But of course, back in New York, WWF would quickly try to put a stop to this when, unhappy about seeing their rivals gaining steam, they'd file a lawsuit against the Southern Wrestling promotion, claiming here that the company were using intellectual property owned by McMahon himself. And the crux of this argument would be that, despite no longer calling himself Razor Ramon, Scott Hall was still effectively playing the same character, complete with all the same mannerisms as before. Ultimately, though, this lawsuit would go nowhere, and after Hall and Nash came out on a subsequent episode of Nitro and confirmed they were not working for WWF, things would calm down. That said, by this point, it didn't matter if they were real-life invaders or not, because people were already sold on this storyline, with it standing out from the rest of the cartoonish efforts on display on the North American scene at the time.